Hallo Freunde, willkommen zurück zum .NET API Review. Äh, Es ist eine lange Zeit, als hier sind wir. Um, but now we have some issues to talk about, so we'll have a meeting. And I have no idea if I got my tenses right on that, but who cares? It's my language, not German. Alright. Um, First up, we have architecture definitions for RISC-V ISA 73437. Is that you, Aaron?
Yeah, just add in more architectures. Nothing terribly profound here. The risk ones. There was some discussion, I think, and sorry, bear with me. I kind of just made a bunch of comments on this rather than actually got super engaged with it. But the idea being that there was some discussion about how many we wanted to add.
All these numbers come from Windows, right?
Correct. They are all from the PE image, and I believe we all validated them. Yeah, Jan jumped in there, mentioned it. That was handled.
Yeah. So my only question is the casing right on all of this, in particular the V?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that doesn't that match what we have in others? When you say which, what are you looking at for the authority on that?
I just you know,
Oh, I guess
you've proposed it here. You mentioned risk dash V for 5, and then that makes it seem like this V should be uppercase as starting a new word component. Like I'm fine with I, S, and C being lowercase, but then it feels like the 5 V should be.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Got it.
Because the word's not riskva, which probably means something in Norwegian.
So if I recall, if I'm looking at something, there is on the machine, there is a there's a MIPS, and we use V in that case as version, I believe. That is capital.
Yep, looks like we're also not consistent with how MIPS gets capitalized. But
oh, yeah.
One of them's all caps, the other 3 are not.
Agreed. I don't think that there's anything wrong with putting it for 5 and then say basically RISC-V 32.
Yep.
The capital V.
Yep.
If I look at the PE, how they document it, it's capital risk RISC dash capital V 5 for kind of what you're pointing out. That seems reasonable to me.
Okay, and we only need 1 in architecture. Like the 1 here and 3 here is correct?
Yeah, so the deal there is the machine one represents the PE itself as defined by Windows and that, and the only support I believe that we're adding in the runtime at present is for 64. So the other 2 in the machine under enum machine is purely for reading those PE images. But I believe the only work that is being done here from the community is adding RISC-V, the 32-bit side of things, the 64-bit support at present.
Sure, but if somebody cracked open a RISC-V 128 PE, then the header will decode correctly now.
Correct. That's the plan. That's the intent. Yeah.
Yep. Comments, objections?
Is capital V your the is that, are we agreeing on that?
I wrote it down and nobody disagreed. So
Therefore, it is.
yep. If RISC people disagree, then it's easy to fix.
I will come back to it. I'm assuming over emails that's easy enough to do.
Yep.
Great.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you all.
Alright, had a first class system threading lock type 34812, which I feel like we talked about before, and now it's back for an adjustment.
Yes. So there are 3 changes in this one. If you can look at the latest diff in the edits of the top post.
I would just like look at the diff itself.
Yeah. Right. So the first part is changing interscope to interlock scope. So the idea here is our current plan is to integrate this with the lock keyword. And since we're going to be using this as a pattern matching, so that any type can opt to integrate with the lock keyword based on the pattern, I feel like the enter scope needs to have something related to lock in the name, so that it signifies that it's associated with the pattern for integrating with the lock keyword. It is a bit redundant in this type, because it's the lock type. We can have both, but that seems a bit much. So I thought maybe we can just get away with one.
Sounds like nobody's complaining.
Alrighty. So the next change is to change scope to a ref struct. The ref struct has a nice advantage that it guarantees that this post will be calls on the same thread as when it's constructed, which means we can save the thread ID, which we get from a thread static, into the scope and then reuse it on exit. It saves as one thread static lookup, so it's slightly more performant in many cases. And it also prevents the odd cases of dispose being called on a different thread, since it won't be allowed in a async method, or at least across an await.
Well, yeah, I was going to say right now it'll prevent usage inside an async method at all. We're okay with that?
Right.
Yeah, because I was going to also bring that up. It seems like a bad idea because it precludes using this from async.
Well, my thinking was that it's pretty easy to refactor that out into a different non-async method and call that from the async method.
If you need to hold the lock across the entirety of your async operation, then you need to get the lock before the await and release it after the await, which means it could already be, so it could be on different threads.
That's in particular, that's something that Count here is trying to avoid, because that's not valid, because this is tied to a specific thread. So you don't want to use this across awaits, and making it a ref struct prevents you from using it across awaits. It also then prevents you from using it not across awaits inside of an async method today, because the compiler doesn't let you use ref structs in that situation.
I mean,
right, like taking a traditional like lock statement versus say using monitor, right? It's like similar, and I've never had to use monitor because of an async method. I've always just split the method.
Yeah, so once we integrate this with the lock keyword, that would also be disallowed because it would be using the ref struct in an async method. But it could
That's
be
already
refactored out.
true, right? Or am I
Today,
wrong?
no, today you can
Oh,
use
yeah,
lock
that's
in an
true.
async method today. You just can't use it with an await inside it.
Oh, okay, it's that smart. Okay,
I see.
I didn't realize that.
But now you'd be not allowed to use it at all. You'd have to call it in a helper method. Because the state machine
Are
is
there
not
any
smart enough
plans
to promote
to?
it.
Are there any plans to allow ref structs, but not across awaits?
It's been talked about. It's been desired. There are no concrete plans to do so. The compiler today basically treats that as an optimization, where it won't lift things to the state machine if they don't span an await. But it still lifts them even in debug. And because it treats it as an optimization, this would be promoting it to be a visible behavioral thing. So it's not a slam dunk, even though we ideally, I've wanted that for years.
Okay. So there's a performance benefit from this. It's about 10 to 15% in the cases where the lock actually does some basic stuff like a couple of list operations, something like that. In some cases, the processor kind of prefetches through the second thread ID lookup. That's what, basically like when you're not doing anything inside the lock. So there's a benefit, but there's a downside as well. I wonder if it would be okay to restrict it for the new lock type, whereas for monitor it would still continue to work. Like if you really want to use lock inside an async method, you could just use monitor.
I'm flipped on this now. I'm convinced I actually probably use lock more in async methods than I realized. Maybe not. Lock is a little weird to use.
You end up
can
using it when you
refactor.
need to do a little bit of coordination with some data structure. You asynchronously do some work, you get a result, and then you shove it into some shared collection, and so
Right.
you lock around that shared collection, or you're processing an enumerable, and so you lock around the enumerator, you get the thing, and then you release the lock and you handle it.
Is there a plan for the lock to use this new type instead of monitor? Or I guess no, it's not, because the point is like, well, if you use lock with this new type, I guess would be the time it would happen.
Yeah, there's a plan to do that at the moment. So you could do lock and then an instance of this type, and it would basically translate that into the using pattern with the scope.
So with this design, if I was in an async method, one like workaround would be to move away from using this lock object to using like a plain object, and then it would be like slightly less efficient, but I could continue to use it inside an async method.
Yep, either that or it could be refactored into a different method. That's feasible.
Yeah, I mean, as long as the lock pattern language feature doesn't end up requiring that the struct be, or that the scope object be a ref struct, then I guess I don't particularly care if this type has cut itself out of working with async methods.
Don't believe the lock pattern should require it. All it would require is the interlock scope method, and then for the scope type, whatever it is, to have the dispose.
Okay, and you've put in the comments here that the dispose is supposed to throw a synchronization lock exception. Um, Generally, we don't like
Yes.
dispose throwing, but I guess if you actually dig deeper in the guidance, it says if it has to, it should. So
It's a weird case. It is possible to copy the abstract before it's disposed, and then you can dispose the original and the copy, and then at the point when the copy is disposed, the second one is disposed to, the thread won't be holding the lock. So that's a weird case where we'd have to throw.
yeah, ideally, the scope will update itself so it can adhere to the rule that dispose can be called multiple times on the same object with no effect, but it may end up not
Yes,
mattering here.
it would do that, but it can be copied before dispose is called.
Right.
So then the copy doesn't.
Yep. Okay, and then we have 3 try versions.
Yeah, so we talked previously about if we can use a scope type thing with the using pattern for try-enter versions of the entering the lock. So there was one proposal with a nullable scope being returned, and I modified it slightly to do the ref struct thing again to get the performance benefit and also make it a bit more readable. So if you scroll down to the usage, it shows an example of what it could look like. I'm not sure if this is something we want, because I think, yeah, that part. So I think last time we talked about, like, we don't want anyone using var something equals the scope, try enter scope or enter scope, as in, like, not even referencing it as a local. This would require it to see if it was entered or not, but this could be a pattern. It saves maybe one line, looks maybe a bit cleaner and has the using advantage.
Right. So the general answer, because you proposed it as a nested type, is if somebody would ever need to write down the type, which you avoided by using var, which doesn't count, then it can't be a nested type. So basically, we only use
Gotcha.
nested types when they're invisible. That's not 100% true, but it's the general starting point. So
Okay,
it would
so
need to go
then
to a
we-
sibling type if it needs to be talked about.
Yeah, so do you folks think it's worth doing this if we were to promote it to a sibling type scope?
It is really weird to have a try method not return a bool. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that the if try finally looks fine.
Yeah, I like that better.
Sounds good to me. I think that's it. A few alternatives I listed, but they're just things I think we've talked about already.
You got this over there.
Thank you.
Okay, so interscope becomes interlock scope. Scope becomes a ref struct instead of a struct implementing a disposable. And that's it, because we then said no to the rest of this.
Yep.
Should we call it try interlock just to be consistent with the interscope is
I
now
believe I
interlock
called
scope?
it. I thought I called it try interlock scope.
So, but the previous try inter is still try inter.
Oh, so those are the regular methods that matches with the inter method.
Right, but we're
It's
renaming
just for the pattern.
interscope to interlock scope.
Oh, I see.
So, are we okay with try inter
Um,
with interlock scope, or do we want try interlock and interlock scope?
I think the lock is redundant in the
Okay.
name. It's just being done for the scope one because it's a pattern. So I feel like try inter is sufficient.
Okay. So enter, try enter, exit, held, interlock scope, the nested struct, and then delete the rest. Okay, obviously I have too many backticks up here. Yep. Okay, let's try to repro the GitHub bug. Comment.
Cool. Thanks,
Yeah.
folks.
Tell Kevin. The video at 10:28 shows the bug is not fixed. GitHub thought they fixed this bug. Alright, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Hash and HMAC one-shots for hash algorithm name 91407. Kevin can't be here, so I'll talk about it. So we've been doing a lot of changes over the past couple of versions to make cryptographic hashing easier. One of the things we did recently was each of the hash types now has a static now has a static hash method on it, and so you can walk up and say SHA-256.hash and do some stuff. You didn't have to instantiate anything. You get your answer. It's a pure function basically, and everything's happy. But then there are a lot of times where somebody needs to do a dynamic operation of they need to hash based off of the algorithm name, which is input, and the naive way to do it, which is in fact the way we did it, ends up the way that you write the switch statement ends up rooting all of the algorithms that you know about. So if you have a helper function and trimming, you end up keeping a bunch of things that you didn't need. We fixed it in our internal implementation, but then that brought up that really we should just make that helper public, and so that's what this proposal is doing. While there's a lot of methods listed, it's really just a span and stream and array explosion of two things. One is hash data of a hash algorithm and the data, and the other is HMAC data of hash algorithm, the key, and the data. And we did a lot of talking about where we thought that these things should go, and the best answer that we ended up with was the cryptographic operations class, because everywhere else that was a better answer was an unsealed type that had derived types, and that meant you could get, so if we put it on hash algorithm, then you could get things like SHA-256 dot hash data of SHA-1 and data, and we thought that was the worst thing ever, and so we said no to putting it on the existing hierarchy.
I just want to make sure I understand one thing. So for the trimming perspective, is the idea that these operations end up the arguments here effectively end up getting passed down to the underlying p invokes without going through dedicated types for the specific. So like there's no switch that forks off to RSA or whatever. It's just we end up calling into os.hmac with the string hash algorithm name effectively.
On all of our current platforms, they all end up being keyed by the name in the native layer. So yeah, it's these just pass it straight through to the native layer, and we drop our types out of the switch altogether.
For what purpose do our types for these APIs for hash data, HMAC data? What purpose do our existing types serve then for these uses? Like, why would I ever choose to use our existing type rather than call this new method passing in hash algorithm name dot RSA or whatever?
Well, RSA is not a hash algorithm.
Sure, right. Yeah.
So
you know what I mean.
it'd be given that the methods already exist. So it's do you think that SHA-256.hash data looks cleaner than cryptographic operations.hash data hash algorithm name.SHA-256, data? So it's
so many more characters.
Yeah, this pattern is increased verbosity if you have a fixed algorithm, but it simplifies things if you have a dynamic algorithm.
So if you were supporting multiple algorithms, the idea is you would accept a hash algorithm name and you'd use this, and if you were tied to a specific one, you'd use the specific class.
Yeah, but at that point, it really is just a matter of style.
They both end up in exactly the same place very quickly.
Yep.
And I assume naming here and arguments, like if I were to go look at SHA-256.hash data, everything would look the same, naming, accepted arguments, etc.
Yeah, I think we had to invent HMAC as a verb because the pattern that was created a long time ago is the HMAC algorithms consider themselves just to be hash algorithms. So we, even though they take an extra parameter, we still called it hash. But here we wanted to make a very strong distinction between the ones that take an extra key parameter and the ones that don't. So we changed the ones that take the key parameter to HMAC instead of hash. That's the only change. Because technically the algorithm in this case is HMAC SHA-256, and we've said we put the HMAC over here and SHA-256 over here. Because again, that's how it works for our native layers.
It was reasonable.
I do like how you can't admit that it's two nouns. We verbed a noun here. No, it makes sense to me.
I mean, cryptographers will say, oh, and then HMAC your data, but
I actually buy that, yeah.
But yes, we are codifying verbing that acronym. All right. Any other comments?
So on the other overlays, this is the question more than a comment, that you said your came from. Do those call it hash data when they take the key and produce an HMAC?
Right. So on the HMAC types, so static HMAC SHA-256.hash data, and Windows will call it. Windows has like bcrypt compute hash algorithm name, you tell it SHA-256, and then in DW flags, you pass a flag that says, by the way, I was HMAC, and then there's in like PV extra crap, you give it the key. Because it's Win32. So yes, they call it hash with a flag of really be HMAC, and then they smuggle the key in somewhere. So we're a little bit more direct. Alright, we're burning through these. Maybe Emo was right in canceling so many sessions in a row. Add a link count by method 77716.
Yeah, I guess I can speak to that. So we approved this API about a month ago, but when we came to the point of reviewing the implementation, if you could scroll down to the bottom of the issue, the question of whether the method should be using deferred evaluation semantics or whether it should be using eager evaluation semantics was something that was debated, and we didn't come to a conclusion. The community member that contributed the implementation used eager evaluation semantics, which I would say is in contrast to how group by behaves. In the case of group by, every time you enumerate the enumerable from group by, you will recompute the groupings. So we had a discussion as to whether count by should follow eager semantics following how count works, or whether it should be using delayed semantics following how group by works. And we thought that if it should be using eager evaluation semantics, it should most likely be returning an I-read-only dictionary instead of an I-enumerable, as was the API originally approved. So that's the question with which I'm coming back in API review.
Okay, so the change is the return type of.
I'll say that in.
I was going to say there's a question first. Basically, do we want eager or lazy? And if eager, then we're suggesting a change in return type.
I was just trying to understand why it was coming back to API review instead of just an argument in the PR. But if it's if eager you want to change the return type, then now I understand why it's in this meeting.
Yeah, I think whether it should be eager or not is also a question for API review. I have a few opinions myself, but I'd like to get thoughts from other folks.
So how would the lazy one work eventually? So it's giving you a count for each item that matches a group, right? Or that
Yeah,
together.
So the original shape would give you back an I-enumerable of key value pair of t key comma int. My impression of how this should be implemented was that it should be delayed or lazy, but the implementer actually came up with an eager approach. So that's when the question came up.
And if it was lazy, as soon as I guess the point here is like the I-enumerable key value pair is like, what's the lazy algorithm? Because like once you have it for one key, haven't you scanned the entire list basically, and you have it for every key?
Yeah, you have to fully compute it before you yield anything.
Yeah, so I mean, for that reason alone, I think eager makes sense, and therefore the API proposal makes sense.
For what it's worth, group by needs to do the same thing, but group by isn't returning a dictionary. And it's not eager either. It will need to run through the entire enumerable when you get an enumerable and call on the first move next operation.
Right. So you could delay everything till then, which I guess is the point. But even if you did delay everything till then, yeah, it's like, what were you gonna do? Not read the first item? Because like.
Other than consistency with one API and inconsistency with another, what is the tangible benefit to having it be lazy?
I think it's convention. Like, I would expect that if the source is changing, users expect that if a link API returns an I-enumerable, if you reevaluate it and the sources change, you should be getting different results. This clearly isn't the case here. Even if we change this so that it returns an I-read-only dictionary, that is still enumerable. So, users might assume that it will get recomputed every time you're calling, I don't know, .count on the thing.
Sure, but two list returns an IEnumerable too. It happens to be a list of T.
Yeah, and these are the only exceptions in the library. Anything that's too concrete implementation, that is kind of forcing the source enumerable and giving you back a concrete collection. But I think that's that exception is very it's very deliberate in its naming and what the naming suggests. Anything else that returns are enumerable, it's lazy.
So yeah, I was writing a mutation example.
Personally, I think if we're going to name it, if we want it to be lazy, it shouldn't begin with the word count, because the existing things that begin with the word count are eager.
Isn't that forced by the return type of count rather than
whatever it's forced by? Today we have parity. Order and order by share the same eager versus laziness. Min and min by share the same eager versus laziness. I would expect count and count by to share the same eager versus laziness. I think there's stronger affinity between count by and count than between count by and group by.
I think I agree with that.
So I have no problem if we want to make it lazy. I have no problem with that, but I don't think this is the right name for it then. And I also then question the benefit of it, because while it might be sort of logically consistent, I can do less with it as an IEnumerable. Best case is if I want to look at multiple counts and not just in a single forward pass, I've got to store it into a dictionary anyway. Might as well just get back to that dictionary.
Assuming we were designing group by today, would you have made it eager or lazy as it is?
Personally, I would have made it eager.
Okay.
I agree. Because you're wanting to do stats on the data. You're wanting to look at it once you've done the grouping. It's not like, oh yeah, eventually I'll get around to asking a group function question.
I mean, I'm sure there's code out there that like re-enumerates every once in a while after the underlying connection changes, but yeah, I don't think that's super common. And you could have always called group by again if it was eager.
Yeah, in the chat, it's pointed out that morelink/superlink does the lazy evaluation. But yeah, I think if we wanted that, we'd call it like lazy count by.
The F# link does the same. So there's a count by method in the F# core library, and it's also using lazy evaluation. I need to check what Python is doing.
I mean, is the expectation that this is part of a larger chain where you do count by and then dot something else and then dot something else and then dot something else, and you may not end up?
You could be like, if you're doing a word count and you want to kind of return the items with the top 10 frequencies, like you'd be doing that.
But the expectation is you might not evaluate the whole query at all. Like the laziness would seem to, the primary benefit of the laziness would seem to be you use it as part of a larger thing, which never actually gets invoked.
Yeah, I think the fact that you need to run through the entire enumerable to yield the first thing kind of invalidates any perf arguments that could be made in favor of laziness. So I think the only reason why we are even considering it is just compatibility with group by rather than anything else.
Yeah,
I'm trying to play devil's advocate with myself, and I'm apparently not succeeding. But I'm trying to say, like, if there was a count by dot select dot whatever, and then you were to pass that whole thing, you return that out of a method call as an IEnumerable of whatever, and then maybe the caller doesn't consume it. Like they choose not to enumerate it for some reason, then there would be a perf benefit there, although in that case I would hope they wouldn't call them in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't know what's more niche. Like, the fact that count by got called, but the thing it's returned is never enumerated seems pretty niche.
Yeah.
Re-enumerating, like, an IEnumerable seems like it'd be the more common thing.
Yeah.
Like, and I do see your point where someone can turn the iRead-only dictionary, even with this new proposed API, into an IEnumerable key value pair. And if they did, like, if they're writing some massive link query where they're just used to, like, everything that returns an IEnumerable always being lazy, like this being the thing that doesn't, even with the updated API, is kind of annoying and, like, not exactly obvious if you thought, like, you could effectively, like, save a query by storing this IEnumerable somewhere, and that's not really what you're doing.
Would we be having this conversation if the method was proposed as count instead of count by?
No, but count wouldn't be returning an IEnumerable.
Yeah.
Like, that's the difference.
No, but count might be very reasonably returning a dictionary.
Like just using the identity selector? Like you want the count of each value?
You're just partitioning the count.
I'm just trying to understand the dictionary you would return from.
The exact same one that's on the screen.
Okay, yeah. So just not letting somebody choose what a key means.
Right. If it was just,
yeah, I guess.
If it was just count that took a source and an equality compare.
I mean, I think in that situation it's more obvious because you, like, built the dictionary yourself, right?
No.
Maybe
you're not building this right. Like if it was the API that's currently on the screen, except it didn't have the second argument, and it was just, and it returned an read-only dictionary from T source to int. Like that would still be count, right? It's not count by, it's count. And the existing count returns an int. So and what, like, the by here is really the key selector, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sure, but
well, that's the difference, though. How does the existing count return a dictionary? Sorry, I feel like I'm being dense here.
The existing count doesn't take an equality compare.
Right.
So, if we had an overload of counts that just took an equality compare, and instead of returning an int, returned the dictionary of T source comma int, right? That would be count, not count by.
Sure, but it would be an overload with a different return type. I think it's the return type that ultimately governs expectations as to how this should be working. At least that's how I tend to view it.
But, well, let me try this different way. If the API that we were proposing didn't involve a key selector, and it was just, I want to take the T source, and I have an I-quality compare of T source, and I want to count, how many of them are, how many of each there are.
Yeah, similar to what we did with the order method that we recently added. So just acting on the elements of the source enumerable. Yeah.
Right. So that one would still be called count, right?
Yeah.
Would it, even though it ends up returning, like, a dictionary? We call it count.
I think it's pretend we never did the original.
The by is about the func T source to T key.
I mean, isn't it about like the fact that I'm grouping things together and getting count of like each group, which you're effectively doing with this other overload as well?
No, I don't think, not at least according to the other buy APIs we have. All of those are, the buy is about transforming the T source into a T key. Order by, min by, max by,
Okay.
I think, right?
'Cause, yeah, I think min by
Yeah,
is
that's-
basically just dot select dot min.
Right.
Not exactly, but
Yeah, but
I see. Okay.
So the line I'm trying to draw is if that's true, then I would still expect count. I wouldn't expect two overloads of count to differ in their eagerness versus laziness. And then if the only thing the buy does is add a transformation from T source to T key, I also wouldn't expect that to change the eagerness versus laziness.
but would you have the expectation that they two overloads would have a different return type? Because we don't do that very much.
Right. And IEnumerable is lazy in Link, and that's like the thing, like generally.
We do it in a variety of situations. We even do it in Link. We've got overloads of zip that have different return types.
Sure.
it's where we introduced our first value tuple in public API.
Should have called it zip 3, zip 4. No, just kidding.
Zip-die.
But yeah, I think that I follow Steve's logic and agree that count feels like a terminating verb, not a pipelining verb. Or rather, that count by and count should have the same lazy versus eager behavior.
Yeah, that was my gut reaction. I gotta say that, like, I see Eric's position more now, but I'm not. I don't think it's a huge deal. Just because I don't.
Do we have good examples? Eric, you threw out a bunch of other libraries or languages that have an equivalent concept. Do we have good examples of where and how those are consumed?
I can try looking them up. I've definitely used the F# variant quite a lot. Are you looking for something specific?
Whether the eagerness versus laziness would actually matter.
I mean, if you don't really do side effects in Link, which you really shouldn't be doing, then it shouldn't matter. And you're most likely to benefit from the fact that you're doing it eagerly. But not everybody does this, and I'm guessing many people will have the expectation that some sort of side effect they've introduced in a select right above the final count by should be evaluating every time you're peeking into the output.
I was wondering if is it possible that, like, people are using the IEnumerable as like basically a func of IEnumerable, right? Like just like the underlying data source is changing and they're not bothering to like redo the link query, and they're just like restarting the enumeration every, like, you know, for a dashboard, like every 5 seconds or something. I don't know. Like, obviously this is new API.
I can see that. You store the func, you store the IEnumerable, and then you just every 30 seconds you for each it.
Yeah, like, and then if you're using count for stats or something like that, or count by or whatever, like, obviously this is new API, but like for other link APIs, something like that might work.
But that's not how many of these methods work, right? A lot of these methods return a scalar, so you don't need to do that either. Right, that only really works if the return type is IEnumerable.
Right, but even the methods that return a scalar, if they're like used inside a select and so forth, it's fine. But in this case, like count by kind of is the select a little bit. You know what I mean? Like, so
I'm not sure I fully understand. Like, I mean, if you have a link query and you say group by, for example, you get an iLookup back. I don't think if you index into that iLookup, we rerun the link query every single time, right? So like at some point we produce the iLookup, and then that's the snapshot of that.
right, but imagine you did a group by and then a count, and you took the resulting like enumerable of key value pair where, you know, so basically say instead of using count by because the API doesn't exist yet, you did group by then count, right? Like, and then you re-enumerated that enumerable, like that would be lazy. And if the underlying source changed, right, once you
It's
get
only
updated
lazy
counts,
until it's only lazy from the iLookup, right? So like as soon as you get an iLookup, we have enumerated the IA enumerable, like the original starting point of your query. And then you get an iLookup that's frozen for eternity.
okay, I don't know what the iLookup is, so I'm out of
Well,
my
the
depth.
iLookup is basically a dictionary that can return multiple values per key.
Okay.
It's basically a glorified iDictionary of, you know, T key, comma, I enumerable of T value.
So you're basically
Right.
saying group by wouldn't work that way.
No, group by, like as soon as you have a group by, like we read the thing, we produce a result, and then the underlying query changes, you never get to observe it.
Okay, so it's lazy, but it's like frozen.
Well, it's
Like if
lazy,
you-
I guess. First time you ask for the key, we enumerate it, and then that's the end of it.
Okay. So if you were to re-query the groups, it would not like redo the work. Like, so if you were to call get enumerator again and so forth, it doesn't like, if you've already called it
Right.
once, it's just going to use that. Okay. So in that case, it really is just affecting people who would have never called get enumerator. As far
Yeah,
as
you
perf
basically just
goes.
don't pay for until somebody pulls on it, right? But
Okay. Yeah,
that
no,
to
that
me is
completely
lazy
makes sense for
visualization.
me. Yeah, now I even care less about trying to make this lazy. I think, yeah, we should just, I like the API proposal and just make it eager.
Any objections to the return type being an I-read-only dictionary versus a concrete type?
It depends
Like
on what we
dictionary?
return. If you return an actual instance of dictionary, then we should probably just return a dictionary.
It will most likely be a dictionary with the exception of empty sources where we'd be returning some kind of singleton to avoid allocations. That's really
I mean more like if the return type is an internal type that you can't cast, then I think I-read-only dictionary makes sense to me. If we return literally an instance of a public type or a derived type of a public type, then people can always upcast it anyways, and then we might as well return the complete type.
The
Well,
empty case is
the question would be
interesting.
whether we care about being able to return different types. So if source is empty, would we want to return array.empty? If we don't care about that, then it could just return dictionary.
But it does mean in the empty case, we would always have to allocate a dictionary, right? Like
Exactly.
we can't,
Yeah.
And it like removes some flexibility, but it does provide some clarity that it's not lazy.
I guess you could have an I-read-only dictionary that was lazy. It would be promptly produced, but lazily fetch the data.
I mean, Eric basically pointed exactly that out. Like, if you treat it as an enumerable and stuff, like maybe people would expect that. I doubt they would, though.
You could make the exact same as the delayed enumerable type that we would be doing
Group
to
by.
make this be lazy, and then it's
The first time you index it, fully enumerates the source.
yeah.
Yep.
Indexing
it's not
is
that
awful,
different.
but yeah, it's possible.
indexing is
Than
01
group by,
asterisk.
apparently.
Asterisk, except the first time. You call .keys and it's like, hold on, that's a very complicated question.
Just
I mean-
return an iLookup. No. I'm learning what this type is right now.
So I mean, I don't. I mean, if we return multiple different implementations based on whether it's empty or other characteristics, then I think iron dictionary is fine. My general concern with us returning something like an interface and we return an actual publicly accessible type that people will cast and start depending on the cast, which then prevents us in later releases to change the type anyway, right? If we ship off the gate with returning different types, then I think it's fine because then people will have broken code pretty much since V1.
So in API design guidelines, right? Like if you are returning, so if you have a public API that's an interface, right? Aren't you like locked into returning like any public types you do in any scenario forever and ever? And so you don't like, even if it
That's kind of
was
what I mean.
conditional, no, but like even if it was conditional, even if in some cases returned one public type, in some cases returned another, like we'd still be locked into doing that going forward.
Well, I mean, it's all degrees, right? It's more
Yeah.
like I mean, it also depends on the scenario, right? Like these, like I think link types are not the kind of types that you expect to serialize cleanly anyway. So I don't think people are very likely to take those and try to serialize them, but you could imagine them doing that, and then it's basically a disaster waiting to happen, right?
Also, people are
But-
just gonna upcast it, right? Or
They do very often, yeah.
or downcast it.
Right, and if the only case that returns something other than dictionary of to key to value is empty, then there's probably going to be a whole lot of people who would call this, see, hey, this is returning a dictionary. If I cast it, I can just fix some data before moving on to the next thing and don't need to do an additional transform. Then they hard cast it, and one day they hit empty and they break. And yeah, that's their bug, but like, it's also a pretty
Right.
niche corner case. Unless we think that people would often be calling count by with empty, and therefore it's totally worth the savings of giving them a singleton empty dictionary.
Would we have it return a read-only dictionary, like without the I?
No, I mean that type is super heavyweight because read-only dictionary I think wraps another dictionary, so you're basically forced to have two instances. Like I think if we so I think the options that we have is I think it makes sense to return an I read-only dictionary, but just have an implementation type that is internal that just implements I read-only dictionary, and then we do whatever we want in there. People don't get to downcast it ever.
Yeah. I think
That's
I like
what I
that.
would do.
Yeah, it's like a little annoying to have to do that extra allocation or whatever, but I think it's worth it.
Yeah, and then Emo, I think you said that group by actually only evaluates once ever for a given source. But looking
Or
at the
given
code,
enumerator.
yeah, I was gonna say every call to get enumerator reevaluates it. So two different for eaches will potentially get two different results.
Oh, so that's what I thought. So I mean, then it actually does change the calculus in my mind a little, because
So,
if you wrote the
what
group
time are you
by,
talking about?
I'm sorry.
If you use link group by, that gives you a grouped enumerable. The grouped enumerable doesn't do eager calculation. When you call get enumerator, it returns lookup.create of source. Since it's not saving that anywhere, if you call get enumerator again, it will once again call lookup.create of source. So every time you call get enumerator, it's reevaluating the input. So it's every time you write a different for each, it reevaluates the input.
Right. So that means if you wrote a group by and then a count today as like a replacement for this, it would, if you're doing like a dashboard based on that for eaching the key value pairs, it might work.
Oh, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong thing. I was looking at lookup. Never mind. I was thinking that group by returns a lookup, but it doesn't. There's also two lookup, and two lookup basically gives you back an I lookup, and that one is frozen.
Right.
But that's, I think, the general nature of anything that's two, right? Two array, two list, two lookup. Basically, it drains the input and gives you an output in the same way that all the scalars do, right? Average, min, max, and so on and so forth. So I guess group by gives you back an enumerable of I grouping. I assume a given grouping is fixed, but then yeah, the sequence isn't. Yeah, never mind.
I mean, I do think this is pretty marginal, but I know.
Yeah. I mean, I just wanted to clarify that in case anybody was depending on false data, like Stefan maybe. But I still think the right answer is count by should be terminating because count is terminating, and if somebody wants to write the lazy one, it's easy.
Yeah, I would say
Basically, it looks like that.
Yeah.
But I just got
from
tired
my
of writing
perspective,
generics.
I still think that the lazy approach is the right way, but if you folks think it should be eager, then let's make it eager.
So, but what would lazy mean? Like, that means we can't return an I.
So lazy
I
is a bit of
group
a
or dictionary.
misnomer. In this case, it's not lazy per se; it's deferred. So the idea is every enumerator forces a brand new reevaluation of the source.
Right.
Because if,
So yeah, then the only thing we could return is an enumerable of key value pair, basically, right? Which is what you're proposing, right?
that's what
Yeah.
we
Well,
approved.
that's what we approved originally, because that's apparently how we thought it was going to work.
But because I think the average caller is only ever going to call it once.
Yep.
Which means that the extra enumerable is just overhead. Granted, they're using link, and link enumerable is not a paragon of efficiency. It tries to be a paragon of convenience, but I don't know it even pulls that off. But it tries more for convenience than efficiency, and so we can say, fine, we'll return the I enumerable. But I feel like anytime I've ever used, for example, group by, what I have to do is take the answer that it gave me, which is useless, and turn it into a dictionary so that I can finally use it and start keying into it. And if we're producing a dictionary in the middle, we should just, I think it's actually just better to just give it to them. And just be like, here's your answer. And if you want this on a deferred pattern, invoke it again.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree, and I think for most reasonable usages of link, I think users wouldn't see a difference one way or another, especially given how count by needs to execute. It needs to drain the entire enumerable, whether it does it eagerly or delayed. My only concern here concerns convention for link methods that return IEnumerable. Like it would be the first method returning IEnumerable, with the exception of all the two concrete thing methods that would be doing that eagerly. Having it return I read only dictionary might mitigate this in that people might spot the difference and realize that it behaves differently, but I still think it kind of violates the convention that exists in link. I'm not saying that the convention is good or bad, I'm just saying that it is there.
I mean, so the one thing I kind of disagree with is I don't think I've ever keyed into it. I think what I normally so especially when I do a group by, I tend to not know the groups. I just do it for diagnostic purposes. And I just want to know how many do I have, and I just print them out, right? In which case, if you give an enumerable of key value pair, I don't care because all I do is enumerate them and print them on the screen, right? And the only thing I might do is I might sort the results by the number of counts in the descending order or something, so I have the highest one first. But I don't know the key. So if you give me back a dictionary, I'm not better off because it's not that I can key into it. At least that's 99% of my use. I don't think it makes a difference because if you give me an I read only dictionary, guess what? I can enumerate that as well, and I get back a key value pair. But I'm not sure that IEnumerable key value pair versus I read only dictionary is often a huge difference for people.
Also,
I think the one
key
argument
dictionary
that
works.
I buy is that you can take the count by stored, and then every time you enumerate it, you basically get back live data, right? I can see that being confusing or useful depending on your expectations. But I think the problem with link today is that we are not, we say we are consistent, but with respect to what? Because it highly depends on what the method is you're calling, right? Some of them are draining, some of them are not. And so eager or non, do you actually get live data all the time? I don't know.
I think it's unquestionably, in my view now, hearing this out, more consistent. Oh man, see, this is where you get to the whole count versus grouping behavior. Because yeah, I mean, there are arguments. It's more consistent to be eager or lazy. I think it's more consistent to be lazy. I agree with
I
Eric
mean,
on that, just because it's doing the grouping thing, and
the
it's returning an IEnumerable.
the other answer is we can try coming up with a different verb.
I don't think it's the verb though. I think Eric's right. I think it's the fact that the return type is IEnumerable, and like two dictionary is pretty easy, right? Like
Well,
if you actually do need the dictionary 10% of the time.
Yeah. So I agree. When the return type is IEnumerable, not when the return type is an enumerable type. ToList returns an enumerable type. It is not IEnumerable. It is terminating. ToDictionary is an enumerable type, but it's not returning IEnumerable. It is terminating. So I think if we make this return something other than IEnumerable, then the convention says it's terminating.
What about ToFrequency count?
Yeah, that's the thing I'm looking for.
But I mean, in all seriousness, like count by is the standard verb in like
Sure, but
many libraries.
If we're having the problem of people think that delayed is the right answer, then instead of count by, we can call it frequency count by, and it'll still show up in IntelliSense when you type count.
I also just don't think making it lazy is that bad in the context of like having used the rest of Link. Like, what's the downside of making it lazy other than it's like you have to call two dictionaries sometimes? Like what the original proposal, right? Like the person who's working on the PR apparently did it eagerly, which is great, and so it started a discussion. But like, if we think lazy's better from like a consumption point of view, it doesn't seem that much worse, and it like unless like are people gonna be burned by it being lazy? I don't think so. I don't think
so when you say lazy, like do you mean we give you back an IB-only dictionary and just initialize it only once you ask for it for the first time, or do you mean every time you pull on it we get the data?
So what I mean is we do the original API where we actually do return an IEnumerable key value pair, and it works like group by does, where when you call get enumerator, it builds up the list of key value pairs.
That what it returns to you is not the answer, but the thing that can get the answer when you call get enumerator.
Yeah, like it doesn't seem that bad. It seems more consistent with the rest of Link, and if someone really expected it to be eager, like.
So to be clear, you basically would propose we return something that is only enumerable, and every time you enumerate it, you get basically we do the computation, and if you wanted a dictionary, you have to say to dictionary.
Yeah, I think that's more consistent with like
I would agree with that.
which I associate it more with personally, especially if it returns an IEnumerable key value pair. I know group by returns like a grouping, but anyway.
No, I think it returns an IEnumerable of
something. Groups
data.
Yeah.
Happy feeling stuff.
That's what I mean.
IEnumerable of I grouping of to key into source.
Yeah, that.
Yeah.
But anyway, I associate it more with that method.
The one thing we should have, which we don't have, is today we should have a specialized dictionary that takes an IEnumerable of key value pair and doesn't require a key in the value selector. Because today we don't have that. Every time you have an IEnumerable of key value pair, you still have to say key value pair goes to key, and then key value goes to value, which is annoying. But
true.
Yeah,
I thought you fixed that.
If we did it and it was recently, I don't think I've seen this. Never mind, we have one.
Yeah, no.
In 8.0 actually, yeah.
Exactly. I just recently used it in 8.0. So good work, us.
Never mind.
Yeah.
Then I'm coming back to the proposal you said. Like let's just say count by returns an IEnumerable of key value pair. If you want a dictionary, you have to say to dictionary, and then you get a dictionary.
Okay, I mean, so from just making sure we all have the same data from the performance perspective, the problem with that is in the middle there was a structured usable dictionary. So if all you want to do is get the data and manipulate it in some way, you now have to take a dictionary, drain it into a key value pair, build that into a new dictionary, and then modify it. And if we had just returned the dictionary in the beginning, we would save a lot of redundant work. But
I mean, isn't that what Link is all about?
yes, but Link is all about doing a thing and then doing it again, whether or not it does the same thing, and then doing it again, and then doing it again, and then your CPU catches on fire, and then it says 5.
I mean, technically speaking, right? Like we return an enumerable of key value pair, right? That is baked by some type, right? And so what we could do is we could say, well, that type, like if you call to dictionary, we can look through the source and say, hey, are you one of those that got? Then we can bypass this. We really wanted to optimize that path, right? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, just have it internally be like have a private dictionary field that we then like transfer or something ridiculous. Maybe that would be.
Well, you would just say that so basically because when you call to dictionary, you invoke it on an instance of enumerable of key value pair, right? That thing could be baked by some type that says, hey, I'm the result of count by. So instead of enumerating me, just do it in a way where you only construct the dictionary once, right?
I mean, we do tricks like that
That's
in
fair.
a bunch of places. The only problem, of course, is code size, and so like we don't add these tricks unless we feel that it's like really on the hot path.
Yeah, they're also
Right.
only tricks we can do. It's not a community sustainable pattern.
That's true. But I would also say, like, I'm kind of like on the boat of Eric. It's like this is a convenience thing. If you really care about perf, you write a for loop.
Yep.
You do it yourself. Like that's just these things are not meant to be used in hot paths, in my opinion. I mean, they're like quick and dirty things you do when you look at data. You want to get some quick things and put them on the screen and then poke with it, right? Similar to how Python's what's it called, data frame APIs work, right? You just want to have something you can easily inspect and mess with, right? If you use it on a billion rows, don't expect it to be super fast.
Use collections, Marshall, instead.
Who needs memory
Yeah.
safety?
I mean, group by is probably still going to always be used more than this, and it has like the same problems that people actually want to use it as a dictionary. So yeah, I don't see any great loss.
Yeah. I mean, in fairness, you don't have to use group by. I mean, if you really want to do functionality of group by, what you usually do is you create 2 lookup.
Yeah. Chat points out that if we go eager and you actually get the dictionary, the one thing that it tells you that the other one won't is what the count of your counts is. So what is the count of your partitions coming out of count by? That's data that the dictionary instance had that the IEnumerable version only sort of has.
And that you have
just
to enumerate to get the count.
Yeah, just
Right.
say dot count, right?
Okay, so now you've walked it,
Link.
and now you can go partition it again, which may give you different data, and
Well, that's no worse than calling to dictionary on it.
Well,
so like,
indeed. Calling to dictionary on it straight away at least puts you in a consistent state, and then now you should ask its count.
right? Yeah, if you're going to do that.
Yeah. But I mean, that's the whole point of the 2 APIs, right? You get a snapshot of the world, right?
Yeah. Okay, I mean, so here's what we approved previously. So, Emo, you saying it should just be IEnumerable of key value pair. That is, in fact, what we approved. And
Yeah, it seems like we are smart people. What can I say?
yeah, I mean, I agree with Mr. Tobe, who had to drop that because count is terminating, count by being terminating sounds more locally consistent, but if we change our definition of local to bigger link, then I am convinced enough that I won't object. I'm just restating things.
I mean, it really depends. I think there's not necessarily a right answer here. I think it's reasonable to say count by returns an read-only dictionary. I think that's not insane either. I just think that in terms of What is more surprising to people? I would think that's more surprising to people. Because I think people can wrap their head around if you have an API that returns a scalar, well, it is what it is, right?
Fair enough.
It
In
is a
some way,
shame that
Link is
Tove's
not
no
very
longer here.
consistent.
Yeah, it'd be nice to just kind of get a better feel of how strongly he felt, but it didn't seem like it was that strong either way for
Yeah.
any of us, to be honest.
I mean, at the end of the day, we approved this back in April. If it had been written in accordance with the design that we approved, it'd be done and dusted. But
So to me, the behavior that I think people depend on is just that every time they enumerate, it pulls on the original source, right? That is a behavior that I think it's reasonable to expect people to depend on. I think, to me, lazy in terms of performance optimization or pay for play, I don't care about that. It's just about storing effectively a query, and then every time you enumerate it, you get fresh data. That is something I see people do.
Yeah, and they might be depending on that accidentally as well, rather than deliberately.
Yeah.
Yeah, honestly,
Very
I think that like 99% of people who use this API are gonna like experience, well, maybe 50% of people experience worse perf. Like the people who are gonna for each over it anyway see no difference, and then there will be like the 1% of people we save like a lot of confusion because they're like, you said, link three queries from source when you re-enumerate.
right,
What it does.
the people that
And have you seen some customer link queries? I mean, they do.
the people
They're
that
like
this will
extreme
hurt
long.
are, as was pointed out in chat, you called count by and you want to console.writeLine had in different partitions colon and then the for each, and that's now either two distinct partitioning events or you were smart enough to call to dictionary in the meantime, and you can get the fun bug of have three different partitions and then the for each prints four of them because somebody else had a reference to your source and added something between those two statements. But it is what it is, and it's link, and yeah. All right. Anything anybody wants written down for posterity, or are we good? Well, the good news is in the PR, all he has to do is that. Just move the work into a lazy guy on that's call to enumerator. All right.
Thanks.
Thank you. And last one on the agenda is add int128 and uint128 get byte support to bit converter 80337. I assume this is you, Tanner?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep, so basically just as it says, we have int128, we've got uint128 now. We've got a set of APIs on bit converter for the other integer types that allows getting the bytes. Basically converting to and from a byte array to or a span, and so the request is just that we provide it for int128 and uint128 as well.
Okay, my only question was going to be, have we already broken the seal of breaking off of the net framework version? And yes, because we added half.
Yep.
I could just have seen that being one of the types that we thought was special. Bit converters try write bytes is... I guess that makes sense. Span's supposed to be first. It just looks weird when it's a static. I have no notes. Yep, start index is what we call it. Okay, going once. Twice. Sold. Okay, and the only thing left that's marked ready for review is, if I understand correctly, not actually ready for review. So I'm supposed to pretend I don't see it. And all right, the list is empty. Does anybody have anything else they want to say, or do we get to adjourn early?
Are you keen on reviewing another link API proposal?
I mean, keen is a stretch, but I think we take it.
Okay. Well, either
You,
that or
you have a number?
Yeah, 91533.
I was going to say I should arrive to these things an hour late more often, because it sounds like you all make some excellent progress.
So, I wasn't.
Oh God. I have PTSD from the previous one.
I was about to say, Levi, you missed the previous one. We took our time. We just had a short list to start with, and the early ones were kind of quick.
Well, I'm out. Goodbye.
I hadn't actually marked this one for review yet, but I was working on it this morning, so it's kind of fresh, and it is related to the count by issue, and it was actually spawned by the previous issue as well. Like if you recall in the original discussion of count by, the other method that was proposed and we ended up discarding was long count by, because of course there's count and there's long count, which for the hypothetical enumerable where bits so big that the int actually overflows, there's the long count. There's the long count method. So we actually ended up not implementing that, and instead I kind of proposed the aggregate by method, which is something that does exist in like big data frameworks like Spark. And the idea here is that this actually acts as a generalization over both count by and group by, and I would probably say it's a useful method. So it again acts as a folding method over the source elements, but partitioned by key. If you can scroll down to the API usage section, I've listed a few examples. So the first one tells you how you can use that to implement long count by, and there the aggregate type is just the count that's being calculated. The folding function just increments the count. You have group by, where the seed function.
Yeah, I mean, obviously. No, I'm laughing, but it makes sense. I mean, that's what aggregation is, right? So.
Yep. Yeah, and the final example I picked up from the Spark documentation. So the idea here is that you are able to calculate scores or add scores partitioned by key. So this is the basic idea. We kind of toyed with that idea during the previous time I created the issue. Given that minds are fresh over the previous discussion, I maybe want to consider this one as well.
So this is the equivalent of like group by and then aggregate on the groupings.
Yeah. Then the idea there is that in many cases when you do group by, you basically do a group by, but then you do a dot select where you perform some kind of reducing operation over the individual groupings. So you do end up with an intermediate allocation. Now the idea with aggregate by is that you kind of eliminate the concept of a grouping altogether, and you just have user-defined state, which gets folded over each individual element that matches the same key.
Like today, if you wanted to do it like quote unquote efficiently with LINQ or whatever, it'd be a lot more complicated, because you could do like a complicated aggregate, right, where you like build a dictionary or something yourself. But
I mean, it's not as complicated as you might think, and especially with the new collections Marshall method, the get value at default, you can do it very easily as well.
So one question: how does this differ from aggregate, really? Because I mean, because we already take functs. Like,
So,
what value does the by actually add that gives you the key?
So in the aggregate, you have one aggregate defined for the entire source. So you're folding over a single point of state for the entire source. In this case, you are actually maintaining different state for every key that gets defined by the source enumerable. So you have count
because
by.
you return a key value pair. Never mind. Yeah. Mother that
Yeah.
was on TV.
It sounds like aggregate can be thought of as a special case of this where every element shares the same key.
Yeah,
Basically.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yep. So what's the T accumulate seed first overload, that's all keys use the same seed, and the second one is you have a seed based on a key selector? Or sorry, you have a seed based on the key?
Yeah. The second overload serves a couple of purposes. Like one, you want to you want to key on the key for the initial value, and also you might want to define an aggregate that is a reference type. If your state is a reference type, the first overload wouldn't work because you'd be sharing the same thing across every key, and that would be bad. So you basically need a delegate so that you instantiate a new instance per key. This is something that you can see from the second sample that implements group by.
No, just be a new list every time you see a new key.
Yeah.
And then why does func have a different signature between the two?
No reason. I figured that if you want the key passed to the seed, maybe you also want it passed to the folding function, but maybe that's redundant because you would be able to encapsulate it in T accumulate anyway should you need it. So maybe it's not essential.
I mean, it seems consistent to me. Like if you pass it to one, pass it to the other.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to hurt, and like technically, like this could all be written as like a normal aggregate, and you could like keep track of the T keys yourself in the accumulate. But like the whole point is you're not.
Right. It's really either there should be 4 of them, or this should be gone, or it should be inserted here. But it just feels like I have an opinion about creating a new seed each time should not change whether or not the key is passed to func.
I'd say we could just get rid of the key parameter in the func.
Did anyone comment on T key being the last generic argument yet?
Not yet. I think it makes sense looking at the order they show up in the argument list, but no, I don't think anyone's brought it up.
It's different than group by though, which is
weird.
Yeah.
But group by doesn't. It has 2.
Well, we need to compare something else that has a blank and a blank by.
Because it's also returning a key value pair of key accumulate. So it would be weird to me that the generic arguments being passed in would be accumulate key in that order.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't really, this is kind of the signature that came out as I was designing it. I wasn't sure at the time whether T key should go after source or at the end. I just put it at the end so that the existing aggregate signature was otherwise maintained. But
yeah,
looking
the
at
most similar group by is T source, T key, T element.
Yeah. I think we have two arguments for moving T key to be infixed because of group by and because you're returning a value that is T key T accumulate. So you're returning a value that is swapped.
Agreed. And the other thing I'm seeing in group by is that the key selector goes at the front. And I'm wondering whether it would be more natural as well to put the key selector as the second parameter.
So swapping it with func.
And the seed, I would guess, or not.
Okay, so promoting it all the way up to after source.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. And then it also means that they show up in the right order in the argument list. Not that that's super important. Like the generic parameters show up in the order they're defined.
Yeah. It's just, it would be weird to have the key selector and the key comparer like not be adjacent to me.
Yeah.
Is that how it is in group by?
That's how it is in group by, yeah.
Yeah. But group by also doesn't have an accumulator function.
But it does have element selector, and it seems similar. It goes like key selector, element selector, comparer. So there's that split.
Yeah, and the longer one is key selector, element selector, result selector, and then null or then defaulted comparer. So key selector and key comparer being far apart has precedent.
Okay. I'll yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up, Levi. I almost didn't bring it up because I convinced myself it's okay, but it kind of stuck out to me as well.
I guess the other question to ask is, do we want to add this?
You mean the overall API?
Yeah.
I like it. It's convenient. You can always use aggregate, like I kind of mentioned, or group by and aggregate, but, you know, to your point, group by and aggregate's less efficient, and doing the dictionary building yourself in aggregate is more painful. So
yeah, I had the need a few times, I'm pretty sure. I ended up doing my own.
I do like the example you gave of summing per key all the different values that exist. Because that seems to me like a good use case for this API.
The long count by?
Yeah.
No,
super terse.
This
no,
one.
not the total scores by key, that one.
Oh, it's
Again,
similar though.
Not my example, but yeah, it's a good one.
Yeah. Oh, except for I see. No, not the same.
Yeah, because you're right. You could do dot group by and then like dot select dot sum or whatever, but this seems a little cleaner.
Yeah, a lot cleaner. If you wrote the group by aggregate, that would be harder to read, harder to write.
Right, and for just to make sure we're happy with the shape, this now actually would be. Well, let's write it like a real person would.
So we're never passing the key though to the aggregate method, or whatever we're calling that.
No.
The accumulate func.
Why would you do plus equal? The assignment doesn't matter.
Yeah, I think it's fine. Like, this is meant to make the easy cases easier, and I think the most common scenarios aren't going to need it.
Right, so aggregate by entry goes to entry ID, start with 0, add things together. I think that looks reasonable.
Oh, that's with the new order,
Yeah. New order, and I got rid of the parameter names just to look at what would it look like if somebody wrote it non-verbosely. And that seems reasonable.
Yeah.
I don't know where the quotes disappear. I guess when you print a string, it gets rid of the quotes. So, yeah.
If someone in the future asked for an overload that took a key in the funker expression for the accumulator, would that be a thing that we could do?
Yeah, that's where I said
Right.
we need to either
Yeah.
remove it from one, add it to the other, or make all four.
Yeah.
The funcs would distinguish themselves based on the parameter count, so it would be a fine overload.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. So we're not precluding ourselves from doing it if people are like, "Oh no, my keys."
Yes, the key that was the current key candidate in the case that multiple keys collapsed to one key under the comparer. I need to know what it was to know how to aggregate it. It's like, yeah, well, they probably wrote aggregation wrong, but sure. All right, so this is all right. I think those are the three things we did. Everybody happy?
Give it.
Right.
Indeed.
Okay, with nothing else having been marked for review while we were talking about that one, I observe the agenda is empty and declare this meeting to be adjourned. Thanks everyone for joining us. Given that the load is light, we probably won't have a meeting on Thursday, but I know there are things in the works, so we may or may not be back on Tuesday. The best hint that you can get if you're watching on YouTube is look at apireview.net, and if there are very few items, then we're probably not having a meeting. That's why the last few have been canceled, is just no agenda items, or not enough agenda items. All right, so we will see you, I don't know, maybe next Tuesday, but at some point in the future at our same .NET time on our same .NET channel. Auf Wiedersehen.
Bye bye.